The human brain is a masterpiece of evolutionary engineering, designed over millions of years to ensure survival in a dangerous and unpredictable world. It is a biological machine that processes information, regulates the body, and navigates social hierarchies with astounding speed. Yet, when we examine the lives of those rare individuals who fundamentally reshape our understanding of the world, the iconoclasts, we encounter a paradox. The very biological mechanisms that allow the average human to function efficiently and survive are the precise mechanisms that inhibit innovation. The brain, for all its complexity, is inherently conservative. It is wired to interpret the present based on the past, to categorize the unknown into the known, and to conserve energy at all costs. The central problem of the iconoclast is not a lack of intelligence or resources, but a biological barrier, the struggle to see the world differently than the way evolution has designed us to see it. To understand why true innovation is so rare, we must first look at the tragic figure of Howard Armstrong. In the history of radio technology, Armstrong stands as a colossal figure, responsible for the fundamental inventions that made modern broadcasting possible, including regeneration and the superheterodyne receiver. His most significant contribution, however, was frequency modulation, or FM radio. At the time of its invention, the engineering consensus was that FM was technically inferior and commercially unviable compared to the established amplitude modulation, or AM. Armstrong did not just disagree with the consensus, he perceived a technical reality that others could not see. He spent years battling the corporate giants of the radio industry, specifically RCA and its leader David Sarnoff, to prove the superiority of his invention. While Armstrong was ultimately vindicated by history, FM radio became the standard for high-fidelity audio. The struggle destroyed him. He committed suicide in 1954, believing himself a failure. Armstrong's story serves as a grim archetype for the iconoclast. An iconoclast is defined not merely by nonconformity, but by the specific act of doing what others say cannot be done. This definition implies a separation from the herd, a divergence that is both psychological and neurobiological. The tragedy of Armstrong illuminates the three major hurdles that the iconoclast must overcome: a difference in perception, the ability to manage fear, and the capacity for social intelligence. In this examination of the problem, I focus on the first and most foundational of these hurdles: perception. Before an iconoclast can act against the status quo or persuade society to adopt a new idea, they must first perceive a possibility that no one else sees. This sounds simple, but it requires overcoming the brain's innate physiological programming. The brain faces a fundamental constraint: energy. Despite its immense processing power, the brain operates on a fixed energy budget, consuming roughly the same amount of power as a standard light bulb. To function within this limit while processing the deluge of sensory information that bombards us every second, the brain must take shortcuts. It cannot analyze every photon of light or every vibration of air as a unique, novel event. If it did, we would be paralyzed by the sheer volume of data. Instead, the brain relies on efficiency. It interprets new information by referencing past experiences and established categories. It makes statistical guesses about the nature of reality based on what has happened before. This efficiency is crucial for survival, allowing us to recognize a predator or navigate a room without conscious thought. However, for the iconoclast, this efficiency is a trap. It essentially means that we see what we expect to see. Vision, the primary sense through which we interpret the world, provides the clearest example of this neurological filtering. We tend to believe that our eyes work like cameras, capturing an objective, high-fidelity image of the world that is then projected onto a screen in our minds. This is a fallacy. The eye is indeed an optical instrument, with a lens focusing light onto the retina, but the process of seeing is not a passive recording. It is an active construction. The retina itself is not a uniform sensor. The photoreceptors that detect fine detail and color are concentrated only in the very center of our visual field, while the periphery is colorblind and low resolution. Furthermore, the optic nerve, which carries signals from the eye to the brain, creates a physical blind spot in our vision where it exits the retina. We do not notice this hole in our vision because the brain fills it in, fabricating a seamless image based on the surrounding data. This phenomenon, the brain inventing information to create a coherent picture, is a microcosm of the iconoclast's dilemma. We do not see reality. We see a reconstruction of reality that the brain has smoothed over for our convenience. The journey of visual information from the eye to the brain reveals how deeply entrenched these interpretive biases are. Signals travel from the retina to the primary visual cortex, located at the back of the brain. Here, the brain begins to extract basic features like edges and contrast. As the information flows forward into the higher processing centers, it splits into two distinct pathways: the where pathway, which calculates the spatial location of objects, and the what pathway, which identifies the objects themselves. It is in the what pathway, flowing through the temporal lobes, that the brain engages in the critical act of categorization. To identify an object, the brain does not simply catalog its physical properties, it assigns it to a category based on past experience. When we see a chair, we do not analyze its legs, seat, and back as novel geometric shapes. We simply perceive chair. This categorization happens almost instantaneously and below the level of conscious awareness. It is a massive energy saver, but it also imposes a rigidity on our perception. Once an object is categorized, our ability to see it as anything else, to see its potential for a new function or meaning, is significantly diminished. This neurological tendency to categorize is the first barrier to iconoclasm. The average brain is wired to force the novel into the familiar. When confronted with something ambiguous, the brain will default to the most likely interpretation based on its statistical history. This is why visual illusions work. They exploit the brain's habit of predictive coding. We perceive a triangle floating in space not because the lines are actually drawn, but because our brain assumes a triangle is the most probable explanation for the arrangement of shapes we see. For the iconoclast, the challenge is to break this cycle of predictive coding. To see differently, one must force the brain out of its efficiency mode and compel it to process information as if it were encountering it for the first time. The biography of the artist Dale Chihuly offers a vivid illustration of how disrupting the physical mechanism of sight can lead to a revolution in perception. Chihuly is the world's preeminent glass artist, known for creating asymmetrical, organic forms that defied the centuries-old tradition of symmetry in glassblowing. His transition to iconoclasm, however, was precipitated by a traumatic accident. In 1976, Chihuly was thrown through the windshield of a car, suffering severe cuts to his face and the permanent loss of vision in his left eye. For an artist working in a medium that requires precise depth perception, this should have been a career-ending injury. Instead, it became the catalyst for a new way of seeing. When Chihuly lost his binocular vision, he lost the ability to perceive depth in the standard way. He described the world as flattening out. To compensate, his brain had to rewire its processing of visual cues. But more importantly, the loss of symmetry in his own body, the daily confrontation with his scarred face and eye patch in the mirror, fundamentally altered his aesthetic sensibility. In the glassblowing tradition, symmetry was the gold standard of skill. A perfect vessel was perfectly round. Chihuly, forced into a monocular, asymmetrical existence, began to perceive beauty in asymmetry. He started creating baskets and C-forms that slumped, twisted, and bulged, shapes that looked like they were yielding to gravity and heat rather than resisting them. These forms were initially rejected by purists as sloppy or unskillful, but they revolutionized the medium. Chihuly's brain, jolted out of its standard processing mode by physical trauma, could no longer rely on the old categories of good glass. He literally saw the world differently, and this altered perception allowed him to create art that no one else could imagine. The Chihuly example highlights a critical mechanism for the iconoclast, the disruption of familiarity. The brain only abandons its lazy, energy-saving shortcuts when it encounters something it cannot categorize. Novelty is the key that unlocks the brain's potential for new perception. When we are exposed to stimuli that we have never seen before, the brain cannot rely on its database of past experiences. It is forced to engage in bottom-up processing, analyzing the raw data of the senses rather than imposing a top-down template. This state of heightened alertness and processing is where insight often occurs. We see this dynamic at play in the scientific breakthrough of Paul Lauterbur, the chemist who developed magnetic resonance imaging, MRI. Before Lauterbur's insight, nuclear magnetic resonance, NMR, was a tool used by chemists to analyze the composition of substances in test tubes. The technology relied on uniform magnetic fields. Any non-uniformity in the field resulted in noise or blurry signals, which chemists viewed as a nuisance to be eliminated. Lauterbur, however, was observing a researcher trying to analyze living tissue and failing because he could not locate where the signals were coming from within the sample. While eating a hamburger at a diner, a setting removed from the sterile dogma of the laboratory, Lauterbur had a visual epiphany. He realized that the noise created by a non-uniform magnetic field was not garbage, it was spatial information. If he controlled the non-uniformity, he could map the location of the atoms. He scribbled the idea on a napkin. Lauterbur's breakthrough was fundamentally perceptual. Every other chemist looked at a blurry NMR signal and saw error. Lauterbur looked at the same signal and saw a map. He was able to recategorize the data from noise to image. This shift required him to suppress the standard training of his field and look at the problem through a fresh lens. Like Chihuly, he took a perceived defect, asymmetry or noise, and reinterpreted it as a feature. This ability to reframe data, to look at the same information as everyone else but perceive a different pattern, is the hallmark of the iconoclastic mind. However, perception is only the input. The iconoclast must also engage the machinery of imagination. Neuroscience has revealed that imagination is not a separate faculty from perception but is, in essence, perception running in reverse. When we imagine an object, we activate the same neural circuits in the visual cortex that light up when we actually see that object. This creates a profound limitation. If our perception is bound by past experience and categorization, then our imagination is similarly constrained. We cannot easily imagine what we have never seen or experienced. If asked to visualize a sunset on a beach, most people will conjure a generic, postcard-perfect image based on thousands of similar images they have consumed. The brain takes the path of least resistance. But if asked to visualize a sunset on Pluto, a scene for which we have no reference, the brain is forced to work harder, piecing together fragments of knowledge about ice, distance, and dim light to construct a novel image. This link between perception and imagination explains why true creativity often requires a change in environment or a bombardment of new stimuli. The brain needs raw material to build new neural networks. Walt Disney's transformation of the animation industry provides a compelling case study of this mechanism. Disney did not invent animation, but he revolutionized it by perceiving it as a medium for feature-length storytelling rather than just short, gag-filled fillers. This shift in imagination was triggered by a shift in perception. As a young illustrator, Disney worked for a company that produced promotional slides for movie theaters. Seeing his static drawings projected onto a large screen, larger than life, changed how he categorized his own work. He began to see the potential for his drawings to hold the audience's attention in the same way live-action films did. Later, the introduction of sound in film provided another novel stimulus. While others saw sound as a novelty or a technical headache, Disney perceived it as a tool to give personality and emotional weight to his characters. Steamboat Willie was the result. Disney's genius lay in his ability to expose himself to new technologies and let those novel inputs reconfigure his mental categories of what a cartoon could be. The process of imagination involves the reconfiguration of neural networks. The brain uses distributed processing, meaning that concepts are not stored in a single grandmother cell, but across vast networks of neurons. To imagine a new concept, the brain must connect these networks in unprecedented ways. This requires the frontal cortex, the executive center of the brain, to direct attention and override the automatic associations of the visual cortex. This is hard work. It requires metabolic energy and cognitive effort. This is why the iconoclast often appears obsessive or intensely focused. They are engaging in a heavy cognitive lift, forcing their brains to ignore the well-worn paths of least resistance and forge new synaptic connections. We must also consider the role of experience in shaping these neural pathways. Experience is a double-edged sword. On one hand, it provides the expertise necessary to understand a field. On the other, it entrenches the categories that block innovation. The more expert we become, the more efficient our brains become at processing information within that domain, and the harder it becomes to see differently. This phenomenon, known as the curse of expertise, explains why radical innovations often come from outsiders or young people who have not yet been fully indoctrinated into the dogmas of a profession. Their brains are less efficient at categorizing the specific data of that field, which paradoxically leaves them more open to noticing anomalies that experts filter out. Branch Rickey, the general manager who broke baseball's color barrier by signing Jackie Robinson, exemplifies how an iconoclast can leverage a crisis to break social categories. Ricky was a baseball insider, deeply entrenched in the system, but he was also a man of deep moral conviction and business acumen. The segregation of baseball was a rigid category. White players were in the majors, black players were in the Negro leagues. This categorization was accepted as a natural law by the owners and the public. Ricky, however, perceived the situation differently. He saw a vast, untapped pool of talent that could provide a competitive advantage. The crisis of World War II, which drained the majors of talent, provided the novel context that allowed Ricky to reframe his perception. He did not just see black men, he saw winning athletes who could fill a desperate need. His imagination, fueled by the necessity of the war years and his own religious upbringing, allowed him to envision a diverse team when the rest of the country saw only segregation. Ricky's ability to recategorize players based on skill rather than race was a perceptual triumph that preceded the social and political struggle that followed. The discovery of the polymerase chain reaction, PCR, by Kary Mullis further illustrates the necessity of a novel environment to trigger iconoclastic insight. Mullis did not invent the components of PCR, the basic chemistry was known. His innovation was in seeing how to combine existing processes to amplify DNA exponentially. This insight did not come to him while he was laboring in the laboratory, surrounded by the routine equipment and social expectations of his peers. It came to him while he was driving along a moonlit highway in Northern California. The act of driving, the separation from the lab, and the meditative state of the journey allowed his brain to disengage from the standard procedural categories of biochemistry and run a simulation in his mind's eye. He visualized the molecules interacting in a way he hadn't before. The novel setting quieted the noise of business as usual and allowed his imagination to reconfigure the known facts into a revolutionary new method. The fundamental problem facing the potential iconoclast, then, is biological. We are fighting against a brain that has evolved to be a miser with its energy. It wants to categorize, to predict, and to stick to the familiar. It wants to interpret the blurry MRI signal as noise because that is the statistically likely interpretation. It wants to see a glass vessel as symmetrical because that is the definition of quality. It wants to see a baseball player as white because that is the history of the game. To be an iconoclast, one must override these automatic processes. One must be willing to expend the energy to look again, to expose oneself to the unfamiliar, and to tolerate the cognitive dissonance of seeing what others do not. However, perceiving the new idea is only the first step. Once the brain has successfully reconfigured its perception and imagined a new possibility, a second, perhaps more formidable, biological barrier emerges. The moment the iconoclast articulates this new vision, they place themselves in opposition to the group. They step away from the safety of the herd. This triggers the brain's ancient and powerful fear response. The amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, screams that isolation is dangerous. The fear of failure, of ridicule, and of uncertainty begins to distort the very perception the iconoclast has worked so hard to achieve. Having solved the problem of perception, the iconoclast must next confront the problem of fear. This emotional inhibitor, and the mechanisms by which it sabotages innovation, constitutes the second phase of our investigation. Before we move on, please subscribe to our channel, Deep Thinker, and hit that like button if you enjoy self-improvement content. Also, don't forget to share this with your friends and family. Alright, let's get back to it. Having established that the human brain is physiologically wired to conserve energy by categorizing sensory inputs into familiar patterns, we arrive at the threshold of action. The iconoclast has successfully overcome the first barrier. They have managed to perceive a new reality, a potential innovation, or a hidden truth that defies the consensus. In the privacy of one's own mind, this perceptual shift is exhilarating. It is the moment of the epiphany, the flash of insight where the pieces of a complex puzzle suddenly lock into a novel configuration. However, the moment the iconoclast attempts to translate this private perception into public action, they collide with a second, far more aggressive biological barrier. They encounter the brain's ancient and tyrannical mechanism for survival, the fear response. The scarcity of iconoclasts in human history is not caused solely by a lack of imagination. It is caused by the paralyzing effectiveness of the fear system. To the brain, the act of stepping away from the herd, of challenging established doctrine, or of venturing into the unknown is not a noble intellectual pursuit, it is a threat to survival. Evolution has sculpted our neurobiology to interpret social isolation and uncertainty as mortal dangers. Therefore, the cause of the iconoclast struggle, and the reason so many potential innovations die on the vine, is rooted in the amygdala, a small, almond-shaped structure deep within the temporal lobes that acts as the brain's sentinel of fear. To understand how fear operates as an inhibitor of innovation, we must look beyond the sensation of anxiety and examine the mechanics of the stress response. When the brain detects a threat, the amygdala initiates a cascade of neural and hormonal events that prepare the body for fight or flight. This system is remarkably efficient for dealing with physical predators. If a tiger jumps out from the brush, the amygdala fires, adrenaline floods the bloodstream, the heart rate spikes, and non-essential functions like digestion and complex reasoning are suppressed to prioritize immediate physical action. The problem arises because the brain uses this same circuitry to process social and intellectual threats. Standing up in a boardroom to propose a radical new strategy triggers the same biological alarm system as facing a predator on the savannah. The palms sweat, the mouth goes dry, and, most critically, the higher cognitive functions of the prefrontal cortex, the seat of rational planning and decision-making, are hijacked by the primitive urgency of the fear response. This biological hijacking manifests in three distinct forms that plague the iconoclast: the fear of uncertainty, the fear of failure, and the fear of social ridicule. Each of these fears exerts a specific distorting pressure on the brain's ability to act on a novel perception. The fear of uncertainty is perhaps the most fundamental. The brain craves predictability. It creates models of the world to predict what will happen next, and when those models fail, when we face ambiguity, the brain registers an error signal that is experienced as anxiety. This aversion to ambiguity is deeply ingrained. In economic game theory, this is illustrated by the Ellsberg paradox, which demonstrates that people prefer a known risk, a bet with defined odds, over an ambiguous risk, a bet where the odds are unknown, even when the ambiguous option might mathematically offer a higher payoff. We are biologically predisposed to choose the devil we know over the devil we don't. For the iconoclast, whose entire enterprise is built on venturing into the undefined territory of the new, this ambiguity aversion is a constant headwind. The brain resists investing energy or resources in outcomes it cannot predict, pushing the individual back toward the safety of the status quo. The second manifestation is the fear of failure, often rationalized in the business world as risk management. While financial risk is a calculated assessment of probabilities, the fear of failure is a visceral emotional response to the prospect of loss. Neuroimaging studies involving financial decision-making reveal that the prospect of losing money activates the same neural networks associated with physical pain and disgust. We do not just calculate loss, we feel it. This loss aversion means that the pain of losing $1 is psychologically more intense than the pleasure of gaining $1. Consequently, decision-making becomes conservative. We stick to established methods not because they are optimal, but because they minimize the potential for the painful experience of failure. However, the most potent and insidious inhibitor of iconoclasm is the third fear, the fear of social ostracism. Humans are profoundly social primates. For millions of years, our survival depended entirely on our inclusion in the group. To be cast out was a death sentence. As a result, the brain has evolved a robust mechanism to ensure conformity. We are wired to agree with the group, to mimic the behaviors of others, and to suppress individual dissent. When an iconoclast challenges the consensus, they are fighting against a biological imperative that equates agreement with survival. The power of this drive for conformity was famously demonstrated in the 1950s by the social psychologist Solomon Asch. In his classic experiments, Asch showed participants a line on a card and asked them to match it to one of 3 comparison lines. The task was visually unambiguous. The correct answer was obvious. However, the participant was placed in a room with a group of actors who had been instructed to unanimously give the wrong answer. Asch found that a shocking percentage of people, roughly 1/3 of the responses, conformed to the group's clearly erroneous judgment. They denied the evidence of their own eyes to avoid the discomfort of standing alone. For decades, the debate centered on whether these conformists knew they were wrong and simply lied to fit in, or if the group pressure actually altered their perception. To resolve this, my research team replicated the Asch paradigm using functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, to peer inside the brains of participants as they navigated the pressure to conform. We used a mental rotation task, asking subjects to determine if 2 3-dimensional shapes were identical or different. Like Ash, we introduced a group of peers, actually a computer program, that provided incorrect answers. The results were revelatory and disturbing for anyone who believes in the independence of the human mind. When participants conformed to the group's wrong answers, we observed activity not in the frontal lobes, where conscious decision-making and strategic lying typically occur, but in the posterior parts of the brain, the occipital and parietal lobes, which are dedicated to vision and spatial perception. This suggests that for many people, social pressure does not merely force compliance, it actually changes what they see. The group's opinion acts as a filter, overriding the raw sensory data before it even reaches conscious awareness. The conformists were not lying, their brains had altered their perception to align with the herd. Even more illuminating was what happened in the brains of the nonconformists, the participants who resisted the group pressure and gave the correct answer despite the consensus against them. These individuals did not show activity in the visual cortex. Instead, their brain scans lit up in the amygdala and the caudate nucleus. The amygdala, as noted, is the center of fear processing. The caudate is involved in modulating motor behavior and is often associated with the pain of independence. Standing alone against the group was not a neutral intellectual choice, it was an emotionally painful experience. The brain treated the act of dissent as a threat, generating a strong negative emotional response. This provides the biological cause for the rarity of iconoclasm. To be an iconoclast is to subject oneself to a constant state of biological stress. The brain punishes nonconformity with the chemical equivalent of fear. This biological penalty for dissent explains why organizations, despite their rhetoric about innovation, so often kill new ideas. It is not just bureaucratic inertia, it is the aggregate fear response of the individuals within the group. We see this dynamic play out with tragic consequences in the Challenger space shuttle disaster. The engineers at Morton Thiokol, who built the solid rocket boosters, knew there was a problem with the O-rings in cold weather. They perceived the risk clearly. However, as the launch decision moved up the chain of command at NASA, the perception of risk was distorted by the fear of failure, specifically, the fear of delaying the launch schedule and losing funding or political support. The management culture, driven by the need to conform to an impossible schedule, effectively rewrote the perceptual data. The O-ring erosion, previously classified as a catastrophic threat, was recategorized as an acceptable flight risk. The fear of the unknown, delaying the launch, was replaced by the false comfort of the group consensus: the launch must proceed. In this high-stakes environment, the fear of breaking rank silenced the dissenting voices, illustrating how fear can warp perception on an institutional scale. To act as an iconoclast, one must find a way to dampen this amygdala response. It is not about being fearless, it is about managing fear so that it does not inhibit action or distort perception. The biography of Jackie Robinson, the first African American to play in Major League Baseball, offers a profound case study in the management of social fear. Robinson faced a level of hostility and social isolation that is difficult to comprehend today. He was subjected to death threats, constant verbal abuse from fans and opposing teams, and ostracism even from some of his own teammates. The biological pressure to retreat, to fight back physically, or to quit must have been overwhelming. His amygdala would have been firing constantly. Robinson's success lay in his ability to cognitively reappraise the threat. He did not ignore the fear, he transmuted it. He reframed the hostility not as a signal to flee, but as a fuel for performance. This requires the heavy lifting of the prefrontal cortex, which can exert inhibitory control over the amygdala. Robinson used the intense arousal of the stress response to sharpen his focus on the game. He channeled the energy that his body was mobilizing for fight or flight into the disciplined physical action of baseball, stealing bases, hitting the ball, and fielding with aggression. He essentially hijacked his own fear system, using the physiological arousal to enhance his performance rather than letting it paralyze him. This ability to regulate emotion, to feel the fear but act anyway, is a critical component of the iconoclast's neural architecture. Similarly, the country music group the Dixie Chicks, now the Chicks, experienced a rapid and brutal lesson in the mechanics of social ostracism. When lead singer Natalie Maines made a critical comment about the President of the United States on the eve of the Iraq War, the group was instantly transformed from darlings of the country music establishment into pariahs. They faced death threats, boycotts, and the mass destruction of their albums by former fans. The reaction was a classic example of the herd punishing nonconformity. For the band, the experience was terrifying. Yet, like Robinson, Maines refused to capitulate. She did not apologize or retract her statement to soothe the herd. Instead, she leaned into the new identity of the outsider. She reappraised the situation. The loss of the country audience was not a failure, but a liberation that allowed the band to explore a new, more authentic artistic direction. By recategorizing the social rejection as a badge of honor rather than a mark of shame, she short-circuited the brain's conformity mechanism. While the amygdala provides the stick of fear, the brain also has a carrot that drives risk-taking, dopamine. This neurotransmitter is the currency of the brain's reward system, but its role is often misunderstood. Dopamine is not just about pleasure, it is about the anticipation of reward and the processing of novelty. It is the chemical that pushes us to explore the unknown. There is a genetic component to this drive. The genes that regulate dopamine transmission, such as the COMT gene and the DAT gene, vary across the population. Some individuals possess variants that result in higher baseline levels of dopamine or more efficient clearing of dopamine from the synapses. These genetic differences correlate with personality traits like novelty-seeking and risk tolerance. Individuals with high novelty-seeking personalities have brains that are hungrier for dopamine. They are biologically compelled to seek out new experiences, uncertain situations, and risks because these activities stimulate their reward circuitry. For these people, the fear of the unknown is outweighed by the chemical thrill of discovery. This helps explain why some individuals, like the contrarian investor David Dreaman or the fund manager Bill Miller, can consistently bet against the market. In the financial world, the herd mentality is driven by the collective fear of loss. When the market crashes, the amygdala drives investors to sell, locking in losses to escape the pain of uncertainty. A contrarian like Dreaman perceives this panic not as a signal to flee, but as an opportunity. His brain does not register the falling stock price as a threat in the same way. He sees it as a mispricing caused by the emotional overreaction of others. He buys when everyone else sells. This requires a dopamine system that rewards the intellectual satisfaction of being right more than it fears the social pain of being out of step with the majority. Bill Miller, who famously beat the S&P 500 for 15 consecutive years, exemplifies this biological immunity to standard risk assessment. Miller did not rely on the safe, backward-looking metrics like price-to-earnings (P/E) ratios that comfort most investors. He looked at future potential, a metric that is inherently ambiguous and uncertain. To the average brain, betting on future potential is terrifying because it lacks concrete data. To Miller, the uncertainty was the space where value existed. His brain was able to suppress the ambiguity aversion that paralyzes others. He viewed the unknown not as a danger zone, but as a puzzle to be solved. This is a crucial distinction. The iconoclast does not necessarily have a higher tolerance for gambling. They have a different calibration for what constitutes a risk. Because they perceive the landscape differently, seeing value where others see noise, they do not experience the same level of subjective risk as the herd. However, biology is not destiny. While genes play a role, the brain is plastic. The fear response can be modified through experience. This brings us to the concept of extinction. In behavioral conditioning, extinction occurs when a conditioned stimulus, like a bell paired with a shock, is presented repeatedly without the negative consequence. Eventually, the brain learns that the bell no longer predicts pain, and the fear response diminishes. For the iconoclast, this means that courage can be learned. By repeatedly exposing oneself to the things that trigger fear, public speaking, social rejection, financial risk, without suffering catastrophic consequences, the prefrontal cortex learns to inhibit the amygdala. The experience of Henry Ford illustrates this learned resilience. Ford failed multiple times before he succeeded with the Ford Motor Company. His early ventures, the Detroit Automobile Company and the Henry Ford Company, collapsed. In the conventional view, these failures should have conditioned him to avoid the auto industry or to be more conservative. Instead, Ford reframed failure. He viewed it as an educational data point rather than a personal indictment. He famously stated that failure is just the opportunity to begin again more intelligently. This cognitive reframing is a powerful tool for dampening the fear response. If failure is categorized as learning rather than social death, the amygdala remains quiet. Ford's ability to strip the emotional valence from failure allowed him to persist in his radical vision of the Model T, a cheap, mass-produced car for the common man, when the rest of the industry was focused on luxury vehicles for the rich. He did not fear the potential failure of the assembly line concept because his previous failures had inoculated him against the paralysis of risk. The cause of the problem, then, is a biological pincer movement. On one side, the amygdala punishes the iconoclast with the pain of fear and social isolation when they attempt to act on their novel perceptions. On the other side, the brain's drive for certainty and efficiency pushes the individual to conform to the group's distorted view of reality. The iconoclast is fighting a war on two fronts, against the external resistance of society and against the internal resistance of their own biology. Yet, overcoming these internal barriers is still not enough. A solitary iconoclast who sees the truth and has the courage to speak it, but who cannot persuade anyone else to listen, is destined for the fate of Van Gogh. Brilliant, brave, and utterly ignored in his time. Perception and courage are the internal combustion engine of innovation, but they are useless without a transmission to transfer that power to the world. The final piece of the puzzle, and the bridge between the iconoclast's private reality and the public's acceptance, is the mechanism of social connectivity. The iconoclast must navigate the complex web of human relationships to sell their idea to a brain-wary public. This requires a different set of neural circuits, those governing reputation, trust, and social networking, which we will explore in the final phase of our analysis. Before we move on, please subscribe to our channel, Deep Thinker, and hit that like button if you enjoy self-improvement content. Also, don't forget to share this with your friends and family. Alright, let's get back to it. The solitary genius is a myth that dies hard. We cling to the romantic image of the iconoclast as a lone wolf, howling their truth into the void, indifferent to the acceptance of the herd. Yet, the biological reality of innovation tells a different story. As we have seen, the iconoclast must first conquer the perceptual shortcuts of the brain to see what others cannot, and then master the amygdala's fear response to act when others retreat. However, perception and courage are merely the internal conditions for innovation. They are the spark and the fuel, but they are not the engine that drives change in the world. For an idea to survive outside the mind of its creator, it must be transmitted to other brains. It must be sold. This brings us to the third and final biological hurdle: social intelligence. The solution to the iconoclast's dilemma, the bridge between a private epiphany and a public revolution, lies in the complex neural architecture of social networking, reputation, and persuasion. To understand the difference between a failed iconoclast and a successful one, we need look no further than the divergent paths of Vincent van Gogh and Pablo Picasso. Both men were undeniably iconoclastic in their perception. They shattered the artistic conventions of their times and taught the world to see differently. Yet their lives could not have been more different. Van Gogh died destitute, alienated, and mentally tormented, his genius unrecognized save by a handful of people. He possessed the perception and the obsessive drive, but he lacked the social connectivity to translate his vision into cultural currency. He repelled people. His social brain was as tortured as his canvases. Picasso, in stark contrast, died a multimillionaire, celebrated as the greatest artist of the 20th century. Picasso was not just a painter, he was a social node. He possessed a magnetic charisma that drew people to him, creating a vast network of admirers, patrons, and lovers who served as conduits for his work. He understood intuitively that for his radical art to be accepted, he had to make himself the center of the conversation. He did not wait for the world to discover him. He colonized the world's imagination through the sheer force of his social intelligence. This distinction highlights a critical truth: successful iconoclasm is a social act. The brain is a social organ, evolved to function within a community. To persuade others to adopt a frighteningly new idea, the iconoclast must navigate the biological mechanisms that govern trust, familiarity, and reputation. The challenge is that the average brain is wired to reject the unfamiliar. As we noted earlier, the amygdala flags novelty as a potential threat. Therefore, the iconoclast faces a paradox: how to sell a radically new idea to a brain that is biologically prejudiced against newness. The answer lies in managing the brain's fear response through the calculated use of familiarity. Familiarity is the soothing balm that quiets the amygdala. When we encounter a face, a name, or a concept repeatedly, the brain's threat response diminishes. This is the mere exposure effect. We grow to like what we know. The successful iconoclast leverages this by wrapping their radical innovation in a cloak of familiarity. Ray Kroc, the man who turned McDonald's into a global empire, exemplified this strategy. Kroc was an iconoclast who saw the potential for a standardized, assembly line approach to food service when others saw only a local burger stand. But his genius lay in his social strategy. He realized that to expand his market, he needed to appeal to families, specifically children. At the time, marketing to children was considered a waste of resources. Kroc defied this convention by creating a connector, Ronald McDonald. By using the familiar, non-threatening archetype of the clown, a figure already established in the cultural amygdala as safe and entertaining, Kroc created a bridge between his corporate entity and the minds of children. He bypassed the brain's resistance to a new business model by utilizing a familiar social signal. This principle of familiarity extends to the physical structure of our social networks. We exist in a small world. The famous concept of 6 degrees of separation, popularized by the psychologist Stanley Milgram, reveals that we are all connected by a surprisingly short chain of acquaintances. However, these connections are not random. They flow through connectors, individuals who possess an unusually high number of social ties. These connectors are the gatekeepers of innovation. For an iconoclast to disseminate an idea, they do not need to know everyone, they only need to know a connector. The tragedy of Howard Armstrong was that he alienated the ultimate connector of his industry, David Sarnoff. By severing that tie, Armstrong cut off the transmission line for his invention. Conversely, Picasso cultivated connectors assiduously. He ensured that he was never more than one step away from the influential critics and buyers who could validate his work. The biology of social connection offers further clues on how to navigate this landscape. Our brains are equipped with specialized circuits for reading the intentions of others. The fusiform face area allows us to recognize individuals instantly, while the superior temporal sulcus helps us interpret the direction of their gaze and, by extension, their attention. These systems feed into the amygdala, which makes a split-second judgment, friend or foe, trustworthy or deceptive. This judgment is often based on subtle cues of eye contact and body language. For the iconoclast, who may be naturally eccentric or socially awkward, this is a dangerous vulnerability. If their mannerisms trigger the foe signal in the amygdala of their audience, their idea will be rejected regardless of its merit. However, the brain also possesses a chemical mechanism for overcoming this distrust: oxytocin. Often called the trust hormone, oxytocin is released during social bonding and has been shown to dampen the amygdala's fear response. In economic trust games, individuals with higher levels of oxytocin are more willing to invest money with strangers. While we cannot simply dose potential investors with oxytocin, the iconoclast can trigger its release through the cultivation of reputation and fairness. Reputation is the currency of the social brain. In an evolutionary context, reputation is a shorthand for trustworthiness. It allows us to predict how someone will behave without having to monitor them constantly. A reputation for fairness acts as a safety signal, assuring the primitive brain that it is safe to cooperate. Warren Buffett, the Oracle of Omaha, demonstrates the immense economic value of this signal. Buffett is a contrarian investor, an iconoclast who bets against the market, but he is trusted implicitly because he has spent decades building a reputation for unshakable integrity. When Buffett speaks, the market listens not just because he is smart, but because he is perceived as safe. He has reduced the social risk of following him. The iconoclast must therefore be obsessively protective of their reputation. It is the only asset that allows them to ask others to take a leap of faith into the unknown. This interplay of perception, fear management, and social intelligence finds its most ambitious expression in the nascent industry of private spaceflight. Here, we see a convergence of iconoclasts who are attempting to do the impossible: open the frontier of space to the general public. This endeavor requires overcoming immense technical hurdles, perception, facing the very real risk of catastrophic failure and death, fear, and convincing investors and regulators that the enterprise is viable, social intelligence. Burt Rutan, the engineer behind Spaceship One, represents the perceptual side of this equation. Rutan saw that the traditional NASA approach to spaceflight, massive, brute force rockets, was a dead end for commercial travel. He reperceived the problem of re-entry, looking not at high-tech heat shields but at the aerodynamics of a badminton shuttlecock. He designed a spaceship that could feather its wings, creating drag to slow itself down safely. This was a radical departure from aerospace dogma, a quintessential act of seeing differently. But Rutan could not do it alone. He needed a catalyst, someone who could manage the fear and rally the necessary resources. Enter Peter Diamandis, the founder of the X Prize. Diamandis understood that to break the paralysis of risk aversion in the aerospace industry, he needed to reframe the fear of failure. He did this by creating a competition. By offering a $10 million prize for the first private team to launch a reusable spacecraft, he shifted the psychological framework from risk of loss to glory of winning. He tapped into the brain's dopamine reward system, encouraging teams to take risks that a standard corporate board would never approve. Finally, the industry needed a social bridge to the public. It needed a connector. Richard Branson, the flamboyant billionaire behind the Virgin brand, filled this role. Branson is not an engineer, but he is a master of social intelligence. By licensing Rutan's technology and wrapping it in the Virgin brand, a brand associated with fun, safety, and customer service, he made the terrifying prospect of riding a rocket into space seem like a high-end adventure vacation. Branson provided the familiarity that quieted the public's amygdala. He transformed a dangerous experimental technology into a consumer product. The collaboration of Rutan, Diamandis, and Branson illustrates the solution in action. A team of iconoclasts covering each other's blind spots, combining radical perception, fearlessness, and social savvy to achieve what no government could. The transition from iconoclast to icon, from the outsider to the standard bearer, is the final stage of this process. It occurs when the new idea is no longer seen as a threat but as the new normal. This diffusion of innovation follows a predictable trajectory, moving from the tiny fraction of innovators to the early adopters, and finally crossing the chasm to the early majority. The key to crossing this chasm is often a generational shift. As we have noted, the brain's plasticity, its ability to rewire itself, diminishes with age. Young brains, flooded with dopamine and eager for novelty, are the natural constituency of the iconoclast. They are the early adopters who are willing to overlook the flaws of a new technology for the thrill of the new. Steve Jobs understood this demographic intuitively. He did not market the iPod or the iPhone as merely functional devices. He marketed them as badges of identity for the creative, the young, and the rebellious. He tapped into the dopamine-fueled drive for novelty that characterizes the adolescent and young adult brain. By capturing this demographic, he created a beachhead from which his innovations could spread to the wider, more conservative population. Jobs became an icon not just because he was a visionary, but because he understood how to craft a narrative that resonated with the biological drives of his audience. Ultimately, the solution to the problem of iconoclasm is a synthesis. The iconoclast cannot rely on perception alone. To see the truth is not enough. Nor is it enough to be brave. One must also be connected. The successful iconoclast is a neurobiological triple threat. They have retrained their visual cortex to break free of categories. They have disciplined their amygdala to withstand the pain of uncertainty and rejection, and they have engaged their social brain to build bridges of trust and familiarity. This brings us back to the fundamental nature of the human brain. We are biological machines designed for survival, not for truth. We are built to filter out information, to fear the unknown, and to conform to the herd. The iconoclast is a glitch in this system, a rare phenotype that overrides the default settings of the species. But this glitch is essential. Without the iconoclast, we would be trapped in a static loop of efficiency, repeating the past and fearing the future. The iconoclast forces the species to evolve, dragging us kicking and screaming into a new reality. The path is not easy. It requires a conscious, deliberate battle against one's own biology. It requires the exhaustion of paying attention when the brain wants to coast, the anxiety of speaking up when the brain wants to hide, and the effort of connecting when the brain wants to retreat. But for those who can master this internal struggle, the reward is the ultimate expression of human agency, the ability to change the world, not by force, but by the sheer power of a new idea. The iconoclast reminds us that while our brains may be hardwired for the status quo, our minds are capable of transcending it.